Hi, my name is Noah Arroyo, and I'm the assistant editor at the San Francisco Public Press. And I'm here with Ora Prochovnick, director of litigation and policy at the Eviction Defense Collaborative in San Francisco, and Shanti Singh, communications and legislative director at Tenants Together, a statewide organization. And we are here to talk about a very important and timely topic, and that is eviction protections, not just in San Francisco, but also statewide. Now, the reason we're talking about it today is because we're coming up on the end of the month. When that happens, when we get to March 31st, if nothing changes at the state level, then we are going to see the expiration of eviction protection statewide. Now, different cities have different protections that sort of form a backstop. We might get into some of that, but what's most important to think about is that, and this is where I'm going to ask for my panelists' take on this, but this is where we might actually see the eviction wave that we've all been fearing would happen come April. So, Shanti Singh, what do you think of that? Is that being alarmist, or is that being fair?
I think that's completely fair. I think there's a sort of a sense, I think, from some corners politically that we really we want COVID to be over, right? We want to kind of say we're back on track, everything's fine, like take your masks off, etc. But the fact of the matter is that, the most vulnerable among us haven't really recovered. And so, yeah, I mean, because of that, we are definitely, facing a serious crisis when, especially with rent relief being so slow to go out, that, if we simply allow the limited protections that are in place, they are limited, to simply expire where people have nothing, you're going to see a lot of people who incurred debt during COVID, rental debt, who will be left effectively defenseless. So, I mean, it's not an exaggeration. It hasn't been an exaggeration the last many times we've said it, where protections have almost expired. Fortunately, in the past, they've been renewed at the last minute. But, I mean, there is cause for alarmism here, especially in a state that already had a massive homelessness crisis before COVID even started.
The implication being that if people are evicted, then their next destination might be to the streets.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it worked before too. So, I mean, that is, eviction and homelessness are intimately tied together. Eviction is a major cause of homelessness.
Ora, I'm wondering if you can sort of bring us up to speed, give us a high level view of where we started back at the beginning of the pandemic and how we got to here.
Well, to do 2 years of pandemic in a few moments very quickly, we had both a health crisis and an economic crisis that were created by this pandemic. And just to tag on to what Shanti was just sharing, even if we are nearing some relief in the health crisis, the economic crisis is still with us. And those who were not able to pay their rent on February 1st are not suddenly going to magically be able to pay their rent on April 1st, because things have not changed enough. So initially, at various levels of government, federal, state, and local, emergency crisis assistance kicked in when the pandemic began in the form of rental assistance and various types of moratoriums from evictions. And we've had various stages and time periods when there was sort of a peak moratorium where nobody could be evicted, to a relaxation of that. So we've had what they've called, recovery periods versus protected time periods. And all of that is coming to an end on March 31st. So in the current period, people are expected to pay 100% of their rent, whereas during more difficult COVID times, people were allowed to only pay 25% of their rent to avoid eviction. We're now at full payment of rent, but there's still protections in the court system as long as all the parties are trying to avail themselves of rental assistance. If our state legislature and governor don't act, all of that goes away on April 1st. There are some local protections that might kick in that time. So there's a mishmash alphabet soup depending on where you live, but we'll lose the significant state protections.
And I'm wondering, Ora, if you can talk about, maybe the best way to do this is generally, maybe it's specific examples, but if you can talk about the types of situations that you found that renters are in at the EDC. You field all sorts of situations and try to give them, whether it's you directly or your staff, try to give them pro bono legal assistance, whether they're going to small claims court or having to deal with, what we call a UD, an unlawful detainer, which is an eviction lawsuit. What kinds of situations are you hearing about and seeing?
So at the Eviction Defense Collaborative, we're the lead agency for San Francisco's Tenant Right to Counsel program. So we see everything. It's a massive variety that comes through our door. Even during this period of protections in place, just in the past month alone, we've seen over 50 eviction cases for non-payment. So no, it's not the tsunami that we all fared in October, but it's a steady trickle. And that steady trickle can flood us eventually just as much as the tsunami can. So it's definitely a serious effect on folks. Even at the peak of the pandemic, when the door was shut and there was a so-called full moratorium in place, we were defending evictions every day, because throughout this time, there was what they call the health and safety exception. Well, that health and safety exception was not well defined. So it was big enough to drive a truck through, and evictions were going forward, and landlords were becoming fairly creative in what they considered health and safety, just so that they could get their lawsuits filed. Even with the protections in place today, landlords are not supposed to be able to start an eviction suit and get a summons issued unless they can show that they've utilized the rental assistance program and the tenant has declined to participate. Well, we're seeing summons being issued despite those protections, and we're having to go in and obtain what's called a motion to quash, which is an argument to the court that really they shouldn't have jurisdiction over the defendant because the summons should never have issued, to give the landlord a benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was negligence or mistake. Sometimes it was outright lies that caused them to disregard the pending rental applications. And this is in the context of what Shanti already shared, which is our state rental assistance program has had a dismal rollout, that half of the applications from San Francisco alone are clogged up in the system and not getting to the people who are qualified and need that money desperately in order to maintain their housing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And to put that in some perspective, these numbers are a little bit old. They're a few weeks old, but at my last check, we saw in San Francisco alone, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million of rent assistance requested, and somewhere around a third of that had actually gone out. And that's through various government programs, not any one program. That's everyone who's seeking it. So, Shanti, I'm wondering if you have a perspective, since Ora focuses on what's happening in San Francisco, I think more than statewide. Shanti, you have more of the statewide perspective. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that is the situation equally dire everywhere, or is it that it is worse in certain places? Maybe there are outliers. What do you see?
I mean, arguably in most places, it's even worse, particularly because, we're very lucky. We're very fortunate to have people like Ora. We're very fortunate to be the only city that has a guaranteed right to eviction counsel, which we only passed a few years ago. And I was involved in that outside work. But what we're seeing a lot too is that, I mean, even upstream, like the goal should be to prevent an eviction from even being filed. Like they should not be filed in the first place, such that someone like EDC has to even deal with it. But what we're seeing is that, legal aid is stretched beyond capacity. So landlords feel empowered to file these cases, even when they're bogus, and, tenants simply move out, right? Or we're seeing in some cases, they're getting just a default judgment because they're not able to get legal representation within 5 business days, which is all the time that they have, right? So a lot of times we're not even really measuring the full scale of displacement by just looking at what's happening in the court system, because so many people are just giving up and leaving, right? We definitely saw the same phenomenon Ora was describing with respect to these sort of, health and safety evictions being kind of bogus, right? That was something, for example, is a huge issue in greater Los Angeles, even when the moratorium was in place. Like we heard it from LA eviction lawyers all the time. So yeah, I mean, there's a lack of legal representation, right? There might be a lack of local protections. There's a few places that still have protections in place, like LA City and Alameda County, because they were able to get through, I won't get into it too much, but they were able to get through kind of a loophole whereby their protections were not repealed by the weaker state protections, but ours in San Francisco was, and it was a very bizarre technicality. But they're under pressure too. But outside of state, LA City, Alameda County, LA County is trying to pass some comprehensive protections. But if it's become so dependent on the city that you live in, or you live in a city that is willing to do more, but they're hamstrung by a weak state baseline. But there's just most folks if you don't live in a certain area, you have the state protections, which are limited, and that's it, and they're about to go away. So I would argue that in a lot of cases, like it is worse out there.
And so if I'm reading between the lines here, then it sounds like the implicit concern from both of you is that up to now, we've still been seeing evictions, but often landlords, well, I shouldn't say often, landlords have been trying to push those eviction lawsuits, sometimes using arguments that were not necessarily above board. Whereas the major injury to them that might be driving that eviction was lack of payment because, of course, tenants are struggling with finding work. The economy still hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And so we've seen the push for evictions all the while. But that has been while they've been hamstrung with state level protections that prevent them from making the argument purely, you haven't paid my rent, so I can evict you. On April 1, that door comes up and they're going to be able to walk through it and say, well, I don't need to make these other arguments. The argument is much easier and it's legal for me to make it. You owe money, I'm going to evict you. Yes?
That is succinctly put, very much the concern. I will put a little silver lining on it that in San Francisco, we have a local measure that was passed by our Board of Supervisors unanimously that puts a new moratorium in place starting April 1st. Because of our rules of government and preemption concerns, it can only affect rent that becomes due from April 1st forward. But in San Francisco, if there's no further state action that changes this and creates new preemption concerns, tenants will not be able to be evicted for non-payment of rent that became due after April 1st if the non-payment is related to a COVID-caused financial hardship. So we won't have all of the court protections. They will have to fight it in court, but it will be a complete defense, and people should be aware of that. And the other thing I think it's important to make people aware of is the state has guaranteed that any rental applications that are completed before March 31st will ultimately be paid. I say ultimately because they're so backed up, it could take months for them to make their way through the system. But tenants should still nonetheless get their applications in if they haven't done so already, because after March 31st, that door is going to close. But if they get it in and completed before March 31st, they're guaranteed up to 18 months of arrears will be paid.
Gotcha. And it sounds like there are two things that we should focus on there. And one is the distinction between, at the local level in San Francisco specifically, of protections for rent and when it became due. That one, so to clarify, if I'm a tenant and I owe rent, if nothing changes at the policy level, like at the state level, if I owe rent for, let's say 6 months during the pandemic, then come April 1st, if I also owe for April, because I can't pay that month either, then I will be protected from eviction for unpaid rent due in April. I will not be protected from eviction for those 6 months of rent that I haven't paid that were due during the pandemic. So that hypothetical tenant can be evicted anyway, right?
They can be evicted anyway if the landlord focuses only on the pre-April rent, is careful in their paperwork to keep the focus on that, because if they ask for any post-April rent, we'll be able to go in and defend. And connected to that is if we can slow down the eviction process, possibly because the landlord makes mistakes in their paperwork and gives us the ability to slow down the process, then perhaps the tenant will be able to access rental assistance. Not guaranteed the way it is now, but if the rental assistance comes through, they'll be able to get that money to the landlord. I should also mention that there will be local money in San Francisco and in some of the other localities around the state. So even if the state money shuts down, we'll have over $50 million just in the city of San Francisco to make sure that our tenants can stay housed and stabilized.
Got it. And the other thing that I want to highlight here, and Shanti, I'd love your take on whether this is a conundrum in other places and not just in San Francisco, but it's that because of this backlog, payments not going out, say even to people who are either shoo-ins to receive the money or have already been approved, you could have this situation where somebody gets approved this month for money that would make them, if they got it, it would make them no longer a target for eviction, because they could take the money, pay their landlord. Now there's no reason to evict them. But because of this lag on money getting out to people, they could be approved for it this month, not receive it until some date after April 1st, in which case on April 1st, they are still potentially a target for eviction. right?
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully, like I said, it's like a lot of or like Ora said, a lot of it is about buying time in court, right? Which is a gamble to say the least. And of course, like thinking, I mean, I'm going to zoom out again and also frame it as, a better policy, an actually effective policy at the state level would have prevented tenants from having to go to court in the first place. It would have prevented dissuaded landlords from filing these cases in the first place, right? And I mean, going back to I think I already told you this in private once, Noah, but I remember I think several months ago was driving to see some family. Was driving on the 101, or rather my husband was, and I saw sort of the housing is key billboard on the highway, and it said apply for rent relief, period, avoid eviction, period. And I think I nearly had a coronary in the car. And my husband was like, "Are you okay?" I was like, "That's not true," But it was a good. I mean, it's good marketing, but there's so many asterisks on it, and so that this is hypothetical that you just described, and it's not a hypothetical for some people. I mean, I don't want to say anything about their cases right now, but I know tenants in San Francisco who are falling through this loophole right now and may be evicted. So, and I mean, not just in San Francisco, but also in San Francisco, where we at least have hopefully better protections come April 1st than most places in California. So, so yeah, I mean, it's been just, it's like an obstacle course in so many ways that tenants have to navigate first to even get the money, but then the fact that they get the money and they can be evicted anyway is just unconscionable.
And if I could just tag on to that.
Yes, please.
I mean, there are so many moving parts. One of the concerns is how complicated and confusing this is for people who are working on this on a day-to-day basis. Imagine for a tenant who all they want to do is to keep their family housed and they don't understand what's going on. So one of the concerns, of course, is that people are going to self-evict. They think that they have to move because behind in the rent. And one of the most important messages we want to get out to people is to stay housed, that there is help available, and that they shouldn't be moving out because of these scary problems that exist. But I also want to say that in your hypothetical, ironically, if a tenant is approved before the end of March and they're in eviction proceedings already, they could stop those proceedings. There's a procedure called a prevention of forfeiture, where even if the cash has not been paid out yet, if they've been approved, the eviction will stop cold wherever it is. What's clearly unfortunate is they're going to lose that tool also after April 1st. So this hypothetical tenant that you've been asking about is protected until April 1st, even if the cash hasn't come through. So they'll be more protected if they're approved on March 29th than they will be if they're approved on April 2nd. And there's no logic to that at all.
I want to take a quick second to address a question we have from Marilyn Lifton. And if anybody else out there has a question, please shoot it our way. You can leave a message in the comments window for this Facebook Live video. You can also email me directly if we don't get to it. I'll follow up with you later. It's narroyo@sfpublicpress.org. But Marilyn Lifton asks, so who gets the state money at some point after the backlog, at some later time due to the backlog, if the tenant is evicted? Who gets that money? Or I think that's a question for you.
Well, the sad news is that the landlord gets the money whether or not the tenant remains housed. So even if a tenant has already moved out, the landlord could be applying for that rental assistance. And even if they've evicted the tenant, if it's approved later, the landlord could still get that rental assistance. So if the goal here is to keep people housed, off the streets, and stabilized, this program is not necessarily achieving that goal.
Yeah, I'll add to that. One of the things that we were advocating for was sort of at least a diversion program like the kind they have I'm actually a Pennsylvania native myself, but that they set up in Philadelphia, where if you filed an eviction case in court for non-payment, as the burden of proof was on the landlord, not the tenant, to actually say, that they had applied for rent relief, that they had participated, et cetera, and, their case would be thrown out if it weren't. The filing would not move forward. So that was something that we were advocating for last year at the state level with the governor and state leadership, legislative leadership, that there has to be some checks here, but that is not what happened. That is not the program that they chose to move forward with.
So let's talk about that. We're in a dire situation right now. I don't think there's any disagreement about that. What are the potential solutions and where could they come from? And I imagine they look very different. Their efficacy is going to be different if they're coming from the state level versus the local level. Shanti, first, what are your thoughts on this?
If the state is serious about, making sure that we don't have another homelessness crisis on top of homelessness crisis, they would, of course, extend protections at their level, but they would also allow for local protections to be stronger. And that is the thing that they're not doing. And that is messing a lot with San Francisco in particular. So, there's that. There was also really, there's a lack of, there's really an inability to admit, legislators privately are seeing that because they're getting constituent calls where, rent relief has become a nightmare on the same scale of, EDD, right? Unemployment. And I've heard legislators make that comparison, and I was like, it's very accurate. But, at the same time, in terms of what the state is going to do at the leadership level, I don't necessarily know if the magnitude of this has hit them, but, they really need to, there's so many things that they need to do, but the state policy should be a baseline of protection for everybody, right? So if you live in a place where you might be a tenant in a place where your city council is incredibly hostile to renters, that's a lot of places in California, and so you may not necessarily have local protections. So there should be a state baseline, but in places where there are a lot of renters and a lot of hopefully politicians who are a little bit more inclined to prevent a massive spike in homelessness in their communities, you should be letting them do whatever it is that they need to do to address the concerns of their communities on the ground. And right now, that's not the status quo that we've had at the state level. Hasn't been the thinking of the state level basically since COVID began. They want to actually quash any further action, and that's created a ton of problems.
You're talking about the state level laws that include a clause that preempts whatever the local level laws are if they were passed within a certain time period.
Yeah, that's correct. And that was that's the real estate industry asked them for that. They snuck it in at the last minute. None of us knew it was coming until the bill came out. And it was like, I remember reading it on my phone. I think I was in Sacramento. I was on the phone with you at one point, just scrolling, reading this and just making sure I knew what exactly it was. But yeah, that's unfortunately the challenge at the state level, and they need to, they drastically need to course correct. And also, there was a lot of unwillingness on the part of state agencies to admit that there were problems, even though if they did admit that they were problems, maybe they have needs, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be an accusatory relationship with tenant organizations. Maybe they have needs, maybe we could help them articulate those needs and those roadblocks, but they've been completely untransparent with us from day one.
Mm-hmm. Ora, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that the real estate advocates continue to be pushing for that preemption. So with the conversations in place right now in Sacramento about whether there will be any further extensions given the admitted inadequacies of the rollout of rental assistance, there's an urging that even very minor continued protections be tied with very heavy preemption, which will tie the hands of folks in San Francisco who have been trying to keep our population housed. So our great hope is either that the complete package be extended for a few more months down to August, or that if it's a lesser version, that it not be linked to preemption so that a law like San Francisco's can take hold. The only other thing I would add is I think some of the lessons that we draw from this experience with COVID is that long-term, the linkage of a basic human necessity like shelter with the intense profit motive does not work. And so we're talking about very short-term measures during our COVID emergency crisis, but clearly there's long-term measures that need to be put into place too.
And I think we have the state has received, and I should say the legislature and Governor Gavin Newsom have received now, as far as I'm aware, 3 different letters requesting from various organizations requesting an extension at the very least of the application period for rent relief, which since applying for rent relief also gives a tenant protection from the eviction process, then that is incidentally also a request for an extension of eviction protections. We've got a letter from the California Apartment Association earlier this month. We've got a letter a letter written jointly by the Western Center on Law and Poverty and the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation. And then one that went out, it looks like just yesterday, from the mayor's office, also asking for an extension of state laws. In both of your opinions, does this change anything? Does this start to create the kind of political momentum that would result in a last-minute shift in policy, the way that we've seen at least twice before at the state level?
I mean, I think it's possible, right? It is on this is like, I think, the fourth time around the merry-go-round, fourth, fifth. I've lost count of, you know, like, because this is all I've been doing for the last 2 years. But it is like
what is time?
Yeah, what is time? But like, there's a cliff moment. You raise the alarm. You know, you try to really like get a lot of momentum. You know, people send letters. These letters have been sent over and over and over again, right? And you know, I mean, it's interesting. I think that the reason that the landlords see the California Apartment Association is fine extending this is because they think they have probably correctly enough latitude to evict people who take the money anyway. So they just want their money, right? So we have a different goal than them. But you know, I mean, this is the fourth time this has happened where a decision's made at the very last minute. It's made without very little to no transparency or communication with experts on the ground, such as ourselves. And, you know, it is possible that there is an extension. I think that momentum is definitely building. We are certainly pushing for one, albeit without preemption. But, you know, that may happen, but it shouldn't be like this. There should have been long-term strategic planning. We should have been looking at stuff like unemployment. We should have been, you know, not just pretending there was a magic day where like COVID ends, right? And this thinking has led to, you know, cycle 1, cycle 2, 3, 4 of just this exact thing where like pressure builds up, you know, and then maybe they do something.
And meanwhile, when the policymakers may or may not do something and it's not clear what that's going to be, tenants are left wondering, and obviously their tenancy hangs in the balance. Ora, you want to give us the last word? We only have about a minute or two left.
Well, I'll echo what Shanti said. That, I mean, to be even more cynical, I think that the Apartment Owners Association is endorsing extension because they want preemption, and they're trying to prevent a stronger protection at some of the local levels. And I am not certain that even without a letter writing that there is the political will in our legislature and governor's office to do what really needs to be done, which is extend the full protections. I am hoping that that's what takes place. And the reverse of that is I'm hoping if they don't do that, that they don't put something very weak in place with preemption. We keep seeing this repeat of a midnight effort to jump in the last possible moment rather than a thoughtful, careful discussion of what needs to happen with all of the affected players in the room. And I would like to naively hope that they would have the ears and mouth of the tenant movement as well as the landlord movement in the room when they try to decide what needs to be done to keep the people of our state safely housed.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Gavin Newsom, my DMs are open. Please reach out.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Again, I am Noah Arroyo with the San Francisco Public Press. This was Shanti Singh of Tenants Together and Ora Prochovnick of the Eviction Defense Collaborative. If you're out there and you need help, if you have questions, then look up our organizations. I've written plenty about this to try to simplify what are very complex policies and restrictions. And Tenants Together is a great resource. And if you live in San Francisco, call EDC, call the Eviction Defense Collaborative if you need help. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And Shanti, Ora, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for hosting us.